We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 12:01. We will finish at 1:01. I recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. While in opposition, the Liberals said that they were vehemently opposed to power rate increases. In fact, last May, the Liberal member for Richmond, now the Minister of Economic Development, criticized the NDP government and said, and I quote, "This government is the only entity that has the power to take action and stand up to Nova Scotia Power." My question to the Premier is, does he still agree that the government has the ultimate power to take action and stand up to Nova Scotia Power when it comes to rate increases?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the simple answer is yes. It's why the Minister of Energy and the Energy Department was down at the rate hearing defending ratepayers, Mr. Speaker, and it's why Nova Scotians can now say that they have a better deal under the Maritime Link Act, Mr. Speaker, and it's why Nova Scotia ratepayers are being protected by this government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how the Premier can say that they have a better deal on the Maritime Link when they still don't know the price that electricity will attract when it gets to our homes any more than the NDP did when they supported it. But what we do know is that Nova Scotians face a 3% increase in their power bills starting this January. While he was in opposition, Mr. Speaker, before the election, the Premier said, and I quote, "It's a sad day in our province when our Premier won't stand up for Nova Scotians." And he went on to ask the Premier of that time, "Will you stand up for Nova Scotians and say no to another power rate increase?" Mr. Speaker, my question is the same question for the new Premier. Will he stand up for Nova Scotians and say no to the 3% increase scheduled for January?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's why the Minister of Energy was at the rate hearing, to stand up, Mr. Speaker, for Nova Scotia ratepayers to ensure that there would not be further rate increases. Mr. Speaker, part of the question was asked today how much the energy would be. Yesterday, imported energy was $53 a megawatt, Mr. Speaker. Energy that was produced in this province was $49 a megawatt, Mr. Speaker. If the Maritime Link had been in production yesterday under the new deal negotiated by the Minister of Energy, we would have had energy cost at $42, Mr. Speaker. That's $7 cheaper than energy produced in this province and at $11 cheaper than those being imported, Mr. Speaker. That's a good deal for Nova Scotia ratepayers.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, having lesser cost than the bad deal the NDP signed, but still more than we pay today, is not a good deal for Nova Scotians. That's what the Premier is missing in his previous answer. Mr. Speaker, when he was in opposition, the Premier said, and I quote, "Do something that will mean something to Nova Scotians today, not 2 years from now." The reality is that Nova Scotians can't pay their power bills today. They're going to food banks today. Mr. Speaker, those were the words of the Premier when he was in opposition. Now he is in government, and he agrees that the government has the ultimate power to save Nova Scotians from the upcoming 3% increase that is real and before them in a month and a half time, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is, will he honour his own words from just a few short months ago and say no to the 3% power increase coming up this January?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, that's why we were down at the URB, Mr. Speaker, protecting Nova Scotia ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. And I want to again remind the Leader of the Conservative Party that if the Maritime Link was in production today under the deal negotiated by the Minister of Energy, Mr. Speaker, it would be $42 per megawatt energy, Mr. Speaker. That is cheaper. And in anyone's mind, Mr. Speaker, in any world, that means Nova Scotians would be paying less for their energy today.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, repeatedly in opposition and throughout the election, the Premier and the Energy Minister railed against funding for Efficiency Nova Scotia. They told Nova Scotians the simple answer was to make Nova Scotia Power pay for Efficiency Nova Scotia through their profits. But now that they're actually in a position to act, Mr. Speaker, the new minister is changing his tune. And I quote, "It isn't as easy as just shifting the fee. To act on this commitment apparently would create all kinds of chaos." So, Mr. Speaker, can the Premier please explain the reason for the flip-flop?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear to the Leader of the New Democratic Party and all Nova Scotians. The efficiency tax will be removed from power bills in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the Minister and the Premier have had ample opportunity during their time in opposition to think through their efficiency scheme, to consult, and to bring forward their plan. But apparently they didn't use their time to do that. The Minister now says there will be unintended consequences if they were to act on what it was a commitment that they made throughout the election and prior to that. So I want to ask the Premier if he could explain what these unintended consequences are and why he didn't foresee them earlier.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear to the Leader of the New Democratic Party and indeed every member of this House and all Nova Scotians. The efficiency tax that was put on by the NDP party in Nova Scotia will be removed off of power bills in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, Efficiency Nova Scotia has saved Nova Scotians, families and businesses, millions of dollars in energy costs. It's a national leader in energy conservation because of its independent structure, which allows it to operate beyond the reach of Nova Scotia Power. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier if he will assure Nova Scotians that their ability to save money through Efficiency Nova Scotia programs will not be harmed by whatever scheme the government and the minister dreams up this time.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the difference between this government and the previous government wasn't about whether or not the efficiency programs worked. It was about who paid, Mr. Speaker. The NDP government believed that low-income Nova Scotians should pay that tax. This government believes, Mr. Speaker, that the utility should be paying that bill.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals promised before the election that they would be the ones to stand up for Nova Scotia Power, including their guaranteed rate of return. But that was before the election. On October 31st, just 23 days after taking office, both the Premier and his Minister of Energy said, no, that's not our plan. They flip-flop, Mr. Speaker. Now they say they only intend to review the rate of return, and we all know how that will end. So my question to the Premier is, does he plan to honour his own promise to reduce the guaranteed rate of return or not?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate again the Minister of Energy for the tremendous work he did by saving Nova Scotia ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, I can't for the life of me understand why the Leader of the Conservative Party is opposed to Nova Scotians paying less for power in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what I am opposed to is a party that says one thing before the election and the opposite after the election. We already had a bad experience on that once, and Nova Scotians don't want to have it happen to them again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier in his scrum with reporters, and I have the transcript and I'll table it, said if you actually read the platform, it says we're going to review the rate of return for Nova Scotia Power, and I'll table that for the benefit of the House. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not what the platform actually says. The Liberal Party platform says, and I quote directly, "We have urged the Utility and Review Board to refuse Nova Scotia Power's return on investment of more than 9% and reduce the rate of return." Mr. Speaker, it's time to tell Nova Scotia Power to look inward for their own savings. I'll table that as well. The word review does not appear in the Liberal promise. The word reduce does, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier is, which is it, Premier? Reduce or simply review?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate all members of the Liberal caucus who stood up to protect Nova Scotia ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate the members of the Liberal caucus who stood up to ensure that Nova Scotia ratepayers were being protected against the monopoly. And you're right, Mr. Speaker. We believe that utilities should look inward to find savings instead of going to the Utility Review Board looking for more rate increases. Why I'm so proud of the Minister of Energy sending his department down to ensure that we rework the Maritime Link Act to ensure that we're paying less for energy in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if they were serious about standing up for Nova Scotia ratepayers, there would not be a 3% further increase coming in January. They would do what they said they would do before the election and deny it. If they were serious about standing up for Nova Scotia ratepayers, they would do what they said they would do in opposition and find out the cost in our homes of the Maritime Link Power before they signed on the dotted line like they are doing today, Mr. Speaker. Instead, they flip-flopped on the Maritime Link. Now they're flip-flopping on an energy price increase that we're all about to pay on January 1st. And my question to the Premier is, why flip-flop now, Premier? Is it just because you got elected?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this government is doing is exactly what it said it would do in opposition, and that is stand up for ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. Under the negotiations, Mr. Speaker, under the negotiations led by the Minister of Energy, Nova Scotians have a better deal now when it comes to the Maritime Link, Mr. Speaker. And under the leadership of the Minister of Energy, Nova Scotian ratepayers will be paying less for electricity in this province.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Energy. The new government has promised to remove the charge for efficient Nova Scotia from Nova Scotia power bills. They promised it in their platform. They continuously called on the former government to enact legislation and removing the charge from the power bills. An article in the Chronicle Herald this morning shows the minister now realizes that, quote, it isn't as easy as just shifting the fee. End of quote. This is just another example of this government making promises on the campaign trail with no plan for delivery. So my question to the minister is, what is the minister's plan to remove the efficiency Nova Scotia fee?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Honourable Member for the question. Let me be very clear. We committed that we will remove the tax that was conceived by the Tories and added by the NDP. That will reduce power rates in Nova Scotia by taking a tax that these two parties believe should still be on there off the bills. Mr. Speaker, that tax will come off, and it will come off permanently.
The Honourable Member for
Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. On May 2nd, 2012, as Leader of the Official Opposition, he asked the former Premier, will he at least guarantee Nova Scotians that he will freeze it and will not continue to rise? In light of the proposed hike in efficiency Nova Scotia charge, one would expect the new government to honour the Premier's words. So my question, will the minister freeze the efficiency Nova Scotia charge, or will he eliminate it?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member may be aware that the increase that Efficiency Nova Scotia has sought, which we have already come out against and are opposing at the board currently, is the result of the way that the previous Tory government and the NDP structured the corporation, which resulted in a tax liability that, had they actually done their homework and made sure there were no unintended consequences of their decision, ratepayers would now not be forced to swallow. So, Mr. Speaker, we are at the board at the moment. We are interveners in that hearing to ensure that that charge is not passed on. The member is well aware that I oppose any increase in the efficiency charge being passed on to ratepayers, just as I oppose to it being on the bills. I'm sorry that the Tories and the NDP still feel that Nova Scotians should have a tax on their electricity bills.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The bottom line is that the government has not been upfront with Nova Scotians on how or when they will remove what they refer to as the efficiency tax. The Liberal platform says it will happen in the first year. The Chronicle Herald reports the Minister of Energy indicates it will be in 2015. In November 2012, the Premier said, if they want to do something for Nova Scotian ratepayers now, remove that efficiency tax and send it to Nova Scotia Power to fill. That would be meaningful. End of quote. Why, Mr. Speaker, is this Liberal government no longer in a hurry? Where is the plan?
Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think the honourable member should talk to the leader of his party, who's been defending keeping the tax on bills. But nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, I have been very, very clear that the legislation would be introduced within the first year of our mandate. It will be, and the tax will come off bills no later than January 1st, 2015, which was our platform commitment, which will make sure that Nova Scotians do not pay that tax, and that legislation will be here within the first year of our mandate, as the platform stated.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, on August the 28th of this year, while participating in the Halifax Chamber of Commerce Straight Talk panel discussion, the Premier, then Leader of the Opposition, was asked if he would honour the then government's spending announcements if he won the election. The member for Annapolis answered, and I quote, "Of course we would." But in an interview with 95.7, just days later, the Premier said he would only honour capital commitments. So, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier, which answer should Nova Scotians believe?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we have made a commitment that we would honour capital expenditure commitments by the previous government. We've seen, quite frankly, what happens to communities when a government comes in and tears away capital commitments that have been made. When the previous NDP government did close the jail in Spring Hill and moved it to Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, we saw the devastation of that community. Was anticipating that. It's inappropriate for a government to come in and cancel those capital programs. But obviously, when any new government comes in, they set their own agenda in terms of what's going to be program spending.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the Chamber panel, the Premier also said that commitments, and I quote, made by previous governments have been counted on by communities, businesses, and families. So I want to ask the Premier if he would expand a bit on what he believes constitutes a commitment that communities, businesses, and families count on.
The Honourable Premier.
I'm not sure what the question is that the minister is looking for, Mr. Speaker. There's obviously been a capital plan put out by the previous government. There were capital commitments made to communities. I'm not sure what else she's looking for. She should be very intimate with the plan. She was part of the government that actually tabled the capital plan in the legislature.
Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in early September of this year, the NDP government made a commitment to long-term care in Nova Scotia, which included 350 new long-term care beds, 750 replacement beds, and plans to allow 3,000 more people to access home care. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, would he tell us if he plans to honour the commitments to seniors and families and communities for the long-term care, new and replacement beds?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how much more clear I could be. If a commitment has been made to the community, has been put before this legislature, we're prepared to meet that commitment.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In opposition, the now Premier and the Minister of Energy criticized the former government for having too many unanswered questions regarding the Maritime Link and how much it will impact Nova Scotians' power bills. So my question to you, Mr. Speaker, is how much will the energy cost? How much will it impact rates?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we are pleased that we are able to actually say what it would cost if this project was in place yesterday as the perfect example, because of course we get the numbers a day after. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the average cost of production in Nova Scotia was $49 per megawatt hour. Imports were $53 a megawatt hour. If this link had been, and we could only bring in 5% of your energy, if this had been in place yesterday, we would have been able to import the energy at $42 a megawatt hour. Mr. Speaker, that is a savings for ratepayers, and I'm pleased to be able to finally, after years of talking about this project, be able to answer that question for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as much as it's nice to know what the power would have been today, what is it going to mean when Maritime Link is in place, Muskrat Falls is connected, and what are they going to be paying at that time? In opposition, the Premier said, make no mistake, quote, make no mistake, the Maritime Link will increase rates for Nova Scotians and their families. And I will table that one. One day after the election, the Premier said, his Liberal government will not support the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project in Labrador unless the price of power is cheaper for customers in Nova Scotia. And I will table that one as well. Now the Premier is on the other side. Can he tell us whether the Premier was right? Will the Muskrat Falls project increase power rates when it comes online?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what is confusing for the honourable member. We know exactly what the cost would have been had it been in operation yesterday. And let me give you some other examples. The average cost, another comparison, the average cost of thermal energy was $75 a megawatt hour. So if the member has a crystal ball and can tell me what coal prices and natural gas prices will be in 20 years, that's great. We'll give him the comparisons. Mr. Speaker, what we can say with absolute certainty now is it is cheaper than the alternate options. And Mr. Speaker, we can say with absolute certainty that it is now, with the current deal we have, cheaper than the alternate options, and we can now provide the price comparison that the previous government was unable to provide because their deal didn't allow for it.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Current minister, same like the old minister. Can't quite tell us what it is, relies on information of yesterday. In opposition, the Premier said the former government was blindly championing a multi-billion-dollar Maritime Link project when they can't even tell Nova Scotians what it will mean to their power bills. And still, we can't really tell. You're giving me a price of what it's going to be, but what does it really mean to Nova Scotians on their power bill? You're really not there. The Liberal caucus put out a news release in May of 2013 and quoted the current energy minister in saying, what's becoming increasingly frustrating Nova Scotians is that neither Emera or the Premier will tell Nova Scotians what the cost of power will be when it comes online. Mr. Speaker, what will the cost be when it comes online?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what's complicated for the honourable member. The reality is, in the previous government's deal, they had no guarantee to surplus energy, and therefore they couldn't tell you the price. We can now tell you that if the link, what the price would be if the link was in operation today. We know that it is less expensive than the coal options. We know it's less expensive than building natural gas plants, and we have all of those price comparisons now, which the previous government was unable to provide. We also know, Mr. Speaker, we also know that it is cheaper than the deferred costs that the Tories champion by waiting and charging people after the next election. So, Mr. Speaker, we now know the costs, we've provided the costs, and if this is inconvenient for the honourable member that we're able to actually provide the numbers, I'm sorry to be so inconvenient for him.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. As we heard just a few minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has committed to honouring the beds introduced early in September. Long-term care beds were announced in communities located across the province, including Pictou County, Queens County, and Lunenburg County. 202 beds were allocated for Glenhaven Manor in New Glasgow, scheduled to begin in 2014. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can the Minister please provide an update as to when people in New Glasgow can expect their long-term care beds?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for that question. Continuing care is on the minds of more and more Nova Scotians as our population ages. And our government is currently reviewing the long-term strategy that's been in place since 2006. And as part of the long-term care strategy, we have to look at replacement beds and the possibility of new beds in the future. What we can tell the good people of New Glasgow is that our plan will have 11 facilities that are currently being looked at, and we will have word on those very shortly.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we asked, our leader asked the Premier about the commitment, especially during the election, from the Premier. Because when you hear of reviews of a strategy or possibilities, then Nova Scotians get concerned, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we ask these questions, and that's why Nova Scotians want to hear from the new government that the proposals and the plan to introduce new long-term care facilities, which are much needed, and replacement beds will continue to happen. So I'd like to, I know that we announced 29 beds were also allocated for Hillsview Acres in Queens County, and they too were also scheduled to begin in 2014. So I'm wondering if the Minister could reassure those residents of Queens County when they could expect the construction of the long-term care beds committed to that community.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to be able to say that these announcements that were made, and I know made very, just days, in fact, before the election call, but the department has gone through a very rigorous review of all of our nursing homes across the province, and they have identified the high needs of many of these homes. In fact, some of them are no longer meeting code in our province, and they are on a replacement pattern for the next number of years. In regards to Hillside in Queens County, since becoming the Minister of Health, we have had a delegation go from the Department of Health to indicate to them to start their planning process and get this particular project underway, since it is long overdue.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that question. I'm a little more encouraged, but still leery, because Because I'm aware of the review that the department did, and there is a current list of facilities across the province that are aged, that need replacement, and new demands in communities that have a void of new long-term care or long-term care facility. So finally, 61 beds were promised to the Mahone nursing home in Mahone Bay and scheduled also to begin in 2014. So I would ask the minister if he could provide an update to the people of Lunenburg County and what they can expect, or when can they expect their long-term care beds to be prepared and start to see the construction of those facilities.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And as a result of the five-part series that the Chronicle Herald did on long-term care, this has become a topic that's on the minds of many Nova Scotians, and one that will be a pressure certainly on our government. We are taking the top 10 or 11 most needed facilities in the province and moving as quickly as possible to have them move through land procurement, through planning, and into first phase of construction as quickly as possible, and we're going to move those in block. I also would like to convey to the member opposite that our plan will emphasize an enhanced home care program. We want to be able to support and to help as many Nova Scotians stay in their home as long as possible, and to do it safely and a high quality of care.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. Cape Breton has suffered under the economic hardships imposed by the NDP. Power rates have increased by over 28% since October of 2009, and I'll table a document from Statistics Canada. Another 3% increase is to go forward again this January, pushing more and more people out of our communities and our local companies out of business. My question to the Minister: will the Minister give the people of Cape Breton some comfort and commitment to standing up for them against Nova Scotia Power and stop this rate increase?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, as a member from Cape Breton, I'm very concerned about the unemployment rate which exists and the challenges that are faced not only by individuals but by the business community as well. I look forward to working with the member and his colleagues from Cape Breton as we identify opportunities both in growing the economy and helping develop our tourism sector. And I'm pleased to report to the honourable member that I've already had the opportunity to meet with the mayor of the Cape Breton Regional Municipality along with several other municipal leaders in Cape Breton, and together I'm sure that we are going to be able to address many of the challenges facing Cape Breton and facing all of Nova Scotia.
Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister has already identified one issue, and that is the rising cost of power for businesses in our communities. Since October of 2009, the population in Cape Breton has decreased by 4,700 people, and I will table that document as well. Full-time employment is stagnant. Nearly 5,000 people are leaving our island for better earning capacity, lower taxes, lower power rates, and Mr. Speaker, I know we're all worried that this cycle may continue. My question for the Minister is, what steps has the Minister's government taken to ensure the power rates for people and businesses are brought back to affordable rates?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I announced today as part of the legislation that was tabled as well that we'll be undertaking a third-party review of looking at the tools that we have at our disposal through economic development, both through our department, through Innova Corp, through Nova Scotia Business Incorporated, to be able to identify exactly how is it that we can help attract business to Cape Breton and throughout the province. How can we work with our existing entrepreneurs that we have in Cape Breton? How can we continue to build, for example, on the credit union small business program, which is at capacity and has been a tremendous success story, and for which our government has committed to increasing the guarantee from 75% to 90%. So, Speaker, those are some of the initiatives that we're working on, and we're always open to new ideas of how we can grow the economy, not only of Cape Breton, but all of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton has an unemployment rate of 12.5%, and I'll table a document regarding that. Mr. Speaker, that is 2% higher than the North Shore, 3% higher than the South Shore, 4.2% higher than in Annapolis, and 6.1% higher than Halifax. With more people looking for work and businesses pointing to energy as a major cost, this rate increase in January will certainly have a negative impact on business in Cape Breton and across Nova Scotia. Will the Minister commit to working for the people of Cape Breton when it comes to stopping this energy increase by Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, obviously we are committed to working with all the residents of Cape Breton and businesses throughout not only the island but throughout Nova Scotia. As I've indicated, I've already met with some of our municipal partners, and we'll certainly be meeting with our federal colleagues as well, so that we are able to establish a good working relationship moving forward. The unemployment rate is way too high, but I can tell you as well, Mr. Speaker, there is a sense of optimism around the business community and around Cape Breton. And I know a recent event that was held in our nation's capital to promote Cape Breton was very well received, and hopefully is going to bring tremendous results. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is I can't tell you how proud I am to serve under a Premier who not only his roots are from Cape Breton, understands Cape Breton, is going to ensure that this government is going to do everything possible to move the economy of Cape Breton forward.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Energy. You know, Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians woke up Saturday morning to a stunning headline that says, Energy Minister welcomes approval of revised $1.5 million maritime link. So, but now, Mr. Speaker, you know, how could that be? Isn't this the same fellow who just 2 weeks before told the Globe and Mail about the maritime link agreement, and I quote him, and I will table it when I finish this, Mr. Speaker, as submitted, this does not go far enough in terms of protecting ratepayers. It's as simple as that. I'll table both documents, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, what new information did you receive that made you see the error of your ways?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I learned upon becoming Minister of Energy is that the previous government had no interest in getting improvements to protect ratepayers in the Maritime Link deal, and yet in eight weeks, in appearing at the board and in discussions with our federal partners, we were able to get changes. And Mr. Speaker, what changed is all 8 conditions were met, and I will table, for the benefit of the House, since the member obviously hasn't looked at it, the opinion put together by legal staff and others showing where in the board's decision each one of the conditions were actually met in full or exceeded.
The The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I know the minister would dearly love to rewrite history, but the reality is he's been against the maritime link, and it's been on record, Mr. Speaker. So what I want to do is remind him on September he sent out a press release accusing the government of today of forcing a misguided and expensive deal on the ratepayers in Nova Scotia, and I'll table that original press release. But for some reason, Mr. Speaker, we couldn't find it on the Liberal Party's website, Mr. Speaker, because it had been removed. But fortunately, we did a little research, Mr. Speaker, and we found the Energy Minister's remarks on a little website called www.reelectkeith.ca. And I'll table that also, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question, did the cost of maritime link change since September? If so, by how much?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, in fact, it did change, and if he had been listening to the answers to the previous questions, he'd actually know that we now have the guarantees can actually say what it costs. Mr. Speaker, the only person rewriting history is the NDP because they're upset that we were able to actually do the things that we said they should do when they were government. Mr. Speaker, let me quote from a Canadian Press article on July 24th, 2013. Well, two quotes from that, Mr. Speaker. One thing Liberals and NDP actually agree on is that the government needs to get electricity from Lower Churchill to meet its energy quota. Then we said both opposition parties, that's these guys and us, said we're careful to state they're not opposed to the Lower Churchill project, only the NDP's handling of it. And I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, that was before the election, and Mr. Speaker, we can now say what the energy price would have been. Mr. Speaker, we now have the ability to protect ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, the board now has the authority with the act we introduced today to have oversight on it. And Mr. Speaker, every single word of testimony that was before that board hearing now forms part of the Energy Access Agreement, and that was not part of the deal championed by the NDP when they were government.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, this guy lives in the world of it's true because I said so. You know, Mr. Speaker, he was against it. He knows he was against it. His leader was trumpeting Hydro-Quebec wherever he could, Mr. Speaker. But of course, you know, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government did submit, Mr. Speaker. They did submit these 8 foibles. But, Mr. Speaker, to the credit of the URB, they tossed them out the door, Mr. Speaker. So I don't know why this guy keep going back to say, we've got the 8 commitments. He sounds like Neville Chamberlain, Mr. Speaker. Peace in our time. He's wrong, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask, did he actually read the report, or is he just taking somebody else's word for it?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Energy has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, one of the things we learned very quickly upon becoming government was the people that actually didn't read the reports were the previous ministers. The ones that didn't read the advice were the previous ministers, and we're learning that very quickly. Mr. Speaker, the previous government took a roadshow around the province championing the previous deal. They said to the board in July that it should be approved without conditions. And Mr. Speaker, yes, I did read the board's ruling. And Mr. Speaker, I have also tabled the analysis by the legal staff that shows that they are all met. So not only do I think that, the legal staff have met that, and they have made themselves available to any member of the opposition to also explain it. Unfortunately, that member has chosen not to avail himself of that because he doesn't want the truth.
The Honourable Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, I have a question for our Minister of TIR, Transportation Infrastructure and Renewal. Residents of Fall River, Mr. Speaker. Waverley, Windsor Junction.
Order. The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll repeat. Residents of Fall River, Waverley, Windsor Junction, as well as additional traffic from Bedford, Sackville, and Beaverbank are very concerned about the potential for accidents. Accidents that occur on both the 102 and the 118 due to safety issues and the high speed. The 102 at Fall River exit 5 in the AM and the 118 in the PM at exit 14 to Fall River. Both have blocked traffic lining up and stopped on the 100 series highway, thus have a potential to result in major accidents. My question is, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister of TIR what will be done to eliminate these safety issues.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. You know, this member has brought this to our attention at TIR several times in the first month and a half of government. It is a very important question. I know that he's heard it many times during the election and since from his constituents, and he's worked closely with the councillor for the area to make sure it's addressed. A couple things that we did, and it is a safety concern. I think that all members, when you come where the 118 and 102 converge in particular, is a very important area for traffic. I think it's 30,000 vehicles per day, which is a large number. We've done a couple things. First of all, one of the big pressure relievers that we've put into place, which was indicated in our throne speech, is the 107 Burnside connector. That's going to affect traffic all in the metro area, particularly during the drive times. We're also looking at some of the changes and improvements we can make at the Fall River exit, and as well, we're looking at another set of connector
Order,
areas.
please.
The honourable minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're also looking at a number of areas where we can look at connectors to relieve the traffic. It isn't, despite what the third party want to rant and rave about here, this is an important question, and I think that the people in the members' area deserve to know. So I will answer the question. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, it is a very important question. We're going to work with the member and work with the department as best we can to help in that area, because it is important. And unlike the previous government, we're going to listen to all our caucus members and we're going to get things done for Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. Full-time jobs in Nova Scotia have been disappearing over the last 4 years in Nova Scotia. We have lost 11,300 full-time jobs. Please allow me to table this document. People who need jobs won't stop needing jobs while the Liberal government drags its feet. Nova Scotia Power is set to increase power bills by another 3% this January. We have seen power rates impact job creation before, and now they're climbing again. My question, Mr. Speaker, is, will the minister stand up for the job creators by saying no to the 3% power rate increase?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and we are certainly cognizant of the challenges that are being faced throughout Nova Scotia, which is why today in tabling legislation we did announce there would be a third-party review of the economic development tools that we use here in Nova Scotia to ensure that they are the best tools possible to work with our small business, with our larger enterprises, in order to help foster economic growth in this province. And one of the success stories that we have had, Mr. Speaker, has certainly been through the Credit Union Small Business Loan Program, which, as I mentioned, is currently oversubscribed, which is a wonderful thing, and as well, which our government, to our Premier, has committed to extending the guarantee from 75% to 90%, which is once again hopefully going to help more and more small business in Nova Scotia grow.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the minister's response. However, 53% of respondents in the CFIB Business Barometer pointed fuel and energy as a major cost constraint. Once again, I'll document and table document number 2. These cost constraints are still their major concerns and are not waiting. They need real attention right now. Our small business owners cannot afford to hire more people due to the rising costs of energy. My question, Mr. Speaker, is when will the minister address the issue of power costs and stand up for small and medium-sized businesses here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister for Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, our government certainly recognizes some of the challenges that are being faced by the business community, which is why we're pleased that our platform did commit to having a review of the tax structure that we have in our province, something which has not been done for many years. As well, we have the Minister of Energy who has already tabled legislation on the issue of power supply and making options available to Nova Scotians and to Nova Scotia businesses to hopefully allow them to get the most competitive rates possible and to make them more competitive. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, our government is prepared to work with the honourable member and all members of this House in identifying economic opportunities, because it's in all of our interests in this legislature to see the economy of our province grow.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Energy prices have increased by 28.5% from October 2009 to October 2013. May I table this document number 3? These energy prices are still 30% higher than 4 years ago. This problem is not waiting. The upcoming increase in January will add to that even more. Unfortunately, it's something business owners have come to expect from their government. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister, is what does the Minister have to say to the people who will lose their jobs due to the unaffordable energy prices come this new year?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, it's in all of our interests to make sure that Nova Scotia has the most competitive environment when it comes to fostering economic growth in this province. But when the member asks what are we doing, one of the things I can advise is that we heard loud and clear over the last 4 years as to the devastation that had taken place in the economy of southwest Nova Scotia based on a decision made by the previous government. And I'm pleased to say that within mere weeks of being in government, that our government was able to sign an agreement which will see the Yarmouth Ferry restored for the citizens of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in May 2012, an online petition created by Mr. Archie Stewart of Port Hawkesbury called for the House of Assembly to use its power to deny any general rate increase in 2013, 2014, and 2015. Well, in opposition, the Deputy Premier indicated that every member of the Liberal caucus had affixed their signature to that petition, and I'll table that. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Does the Minister recall signing this petition?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I not only signed it, I went to the board to champion it, and I fought against that rate increase down there.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was assured that the Minister would recall signing the petition. Well, in opposition, referring to climbing power rates, the Minister of Energy said, and I'll quote, "It is not fair to Nova Scotians for the Premier and other members of his caucus to have stood in opposition and complained about the exact things that they will now not take action on." I'll table that. This government has given Nova Scotians no reason to think that they will oppose the upcoming power rate hike. Will the Minister honour his words and stand up for Nova Scotians and say no to the 3% power rate hike?
The Honourable
Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do understand the honourable member is new, so he may not understand that the decision of the board that the decision of the board for 2014 was made some months ago. We challenged that decision, but for a government to actually overrule after the fact, which is not what we suggested should be done, Mr. Speaker, we asked the previous government to ensure it didn't happen before the decision was made by the board. It is countries like Venezuela and Belize that take independent decisions of boards and then overrule them, which would create significant upheaval in the economy of Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member would like this government to act like Venezuela or so forth, we know where they want to go. But, Mr. Speaker, if the member truly wants to see rate relief for the people of Nova Scotia, then maybe he should convince the leader of his party that keeping a tax on electricity bills is actually the wrong thing to do.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for acknowledging that I'm a new and that there are limitations to things I might understand. But one thing I do understand is when somebody says one thing and does another. And the bottom line is that the Liberals promised to stand up for Nova Scotians against the power company, and they've been quiet. These problems didn't wait while we rode on the election trail. Nova Scotians can't afford another rate increase. Will the minister explain what he plans to do about the upcoming 3% power rate increase in January?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member thinks that we have said nothing to Emir Nova Scotia Power, whether publicly or otherwise, I'm going to buy him a subscription to the newspaper and to the Herald. It's almost, Mr. Speaker, it's almost laughable. The reality is, never once, Mr. Speaker, never once in opposition did I say that the government should overrule a decision of the board after the decision had been made. Mr. Speaker, I said that the previous government should be down there and stop decisions of the board before they were made. Absolutely, but Mr. Speaker, this is a decision that was made, and if the honourable member, and honestly, the leader of the official opposition should know better, since he champions himself as a chartered accountant, he should actually know better. But we go with what we have. The reality is that he should know, and that member should know, there would be actually a worse impact to the economy and to the economic markets by retroactively at this late date overruling the decision of an independent board. The member knows that, and to say anything else is not only disingenuous, but knows that all the things they've just asked about earlier about economic development, they put those things at risk.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the minister responsible for the Disabled Persons Commission Act. In late August, as minister, I announced that persons with disabilities, seniors, and people with mental health issues will be able to choose the kinds of services and supports they need to live with greater independence in their communities, and I will table that release, explaining the 3 immediate actions were to be taken this fall in continuing care and services for persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, in the throne speech last week, the government's strategic priorities made very little mention of people with disabilities. Can the minister explain this serious oversight?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question. Kind of hard to explain something that really doesn't exist. I'm very pleased to say that the Department of Community Services and the Disabled Persons Commission is very much going forward with the roadmap document that was done over the summer and released in August of 2013. I've met with the committee. I've given them my commitment, and I'm very pleased that there will be flexibility and choice for persons with disabilities in where they are housed in the coming years in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her first supplementary.
Speaker, how surprising to say that it doesn't exist when community and advocates and persons with disabilities came together for over a 2-year period with professionals like Michael Bach to develop that strategy, and to say it doesn't exist. That's a problem. Mr. Speaker, during the election campaign, this Liberal government promised to cut 1% from the department budgets. So the question is my discussion with parents of children living with disabilities and the disabled community as a whole, how is she explaining increasing services while at the same time making a 1% cut. Just another Liberal flip-flop.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. I'd like to correct the former Minister of Community Services in saying that the oversight was actually in that it wasn't an oversight. Thank you. The second thing is the 1% will be in inefficiencies within the department and absolutely not affect program delivery or frontline services. We are committed to making sure that programs are delivered to the vulnerable Nova Scotians that need them, that are through this department.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell us just how committed she is to the roadmap and in what direction, and when will we see more information coming forth to people with disabilities?
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions to ministers has expired. I recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on my behalf of House Leader of the New Democratic Party, today in question period, we saw something that hasn't been done in this House in my almost 16 years here, and that was a question asked by a government backbencher. It's been the tradition of this House, my understanding, is that question period would be by the opposition parties and by independent members. That's been my recollection. So, Mr. Speaker, I asked you to make a ruling on this. We did have a conversation aside with the government House Leader.